listener production.
Hello, welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sacha, Barbour, Gatt. Journalists and the media often cop a lot of flack for how they cover major events, especially natural disasters. The line between informative and alarming can often blur, and mainstream news channels have been called out for overdoing their coverage of ex-tropical Cyclone Alfred.
Now that we can cross to people on a phone, I think we all need to sit down and go, if people are giving us a hard time for that and it's become a parody, do we do that anymore?
Someone who knows all too well what goes on in TV newsrooms is former host of The Briefing, Katrina Blowers. She'll join us later on in this episode to answer to the criticism. But first, as always, it is time for the headlines with Chris Spyrou on Tuesday, March 11.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. With hopes of a tariff carve-out fading, our relations with the US have once again copped a blow. This time, Donald Trump and Malcolm Turnbull at the centre. The pair have become engaged in a bitter back and forth, trading barbs and putting the relationship between Australia and America on a knife's edge. This has all come from an interview the former PM gave yesterday, in which he described the US president as chaotic, rude, abusive and erratic, behaviour he warned China would seize upon and turn more and more allies toward Beijing. It wasn't long after that the insults started coming in thick and fast, Trump taking to Truth Social in the afternoon to call Turnbull a weak and ineffective leader who led Australia from behind and never understood what was going on in China.
Yeah, it's not the sort of attention we want from the US at the moment, as you said, when we're trying to get a tariff carve-out. Then last night, our 29th Prime Minister decided to double down, appearing on the ABC's 7:30 to defend his decision to speak out.
The impact Trump is having on the world, on the Western Alliance, on markets, on our economies, these are matters that we have to talk about. We cannot continue this bipartisan gaslighting that is going on at the moment.
Yeah, so basically it could be viewed, that comment, as a bit of a question to Canberra. Both sides, especially Anthony Albanese, have said, we're not going to have this running commentary of every little thing Trump says, which is fair enough. Like, we're Australia. We don't need to talk about everything that Trump is saying. However, when it directly relates to us and potentially, Western alliances, the question is, do we have that responsibility to actually say, well, we don't agree with this and we don't think that's right? At the moment, though, they don't want Australia to cop those tariffs, so they are towing the line very carefully. And that's a point that Turnbull actually made. He went on to call Trump a bully who just likes to be surrounded by sycophants.
The reality is, if you suck up to bullies, whether it's in the global affairs or in the playground, you just get more bullying. The leaders of other countries, particularly friendly countries, are among the few people that can speak truth to Trump because he can't sack them.
So a leader who's doing just that is Canada's newly appointed PM, former banker Mark Carney. Now, the 59-year-old has just taken the reins off Justin Trudeau. He won 86% of party votes yesterday. And on the Trump issue, he had this to say.
My government will keep our tariffs on until the Americans show us respect.
Yeah, which is a strong position that we're not kind of seeing from the West at the moment. I know we're seeing a lot of opposition leaders and parties that aren't in power being hypercritical of Trump, which, when you're not in power is an easy thing to do because you're not the one that's going to be, have the finger pointed at you if things go badly. Turnbull was also pressed on the tariffs issue in this interview on 7:30 on the ABC, and he pretty much said he doesn't think that we're going to get a carve-out this time around. That's something that White House officials have also hinted at, saying that the president does not like the word exemption. I don't know why I went into that accent, but they said he doesn't like the word exemption, and Turnbull has pretty much said we probably won't see a repeat of what we saw in 2018 where our metals were exempt from US tariffs, because that opened up a whole kind of floodgates of exemptions, and the US are not looking to do that this time around.
Yeah, and look, there is a deadline looming for the tariffs issue. It's the 12th of March, which is tomorrow. So, that's why that issue is bubbling up again. So we very well could see Australia impacted by tariffs, just like we've seen Canada and Mexico.
Sticking with foreign politics, Russia has issued a warning to Australia against deploying troops to Ukraine as part of a proposed international peacekeeping effort, saying it would lead to, quote, grave consequences. In a statement, the Russian embassy in Australia said the European proposal to get Allied boots on the ground in Ukraine is designed to, quote, undermine peace efforts, and that Russia will not remain passive observers. The PM and Foreign Minister are yet to reply.
Ukraine's ambassador to Australia, however, has urged Australia to ignore the warning, unsurprisingly. He says it is another empty threat from Moscow, not dissimilar to the threat of nuclear war that Putin has been making pretty much non-stop since February of 2022. Look, something that's also happening at the moment is that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has arrived in Saudi Arabia. Now, that country is going to play a mediating role with the US. Now, this is the first time that Ukraine and the US are going to have any sort of meeting. It's not Trump, it's Marco Rubio, who's the Secretary of State. He's flown to Saudi Arabia as well, where the two are going to meet to discuss the way out and possible peace with Russia. Now, Ukraine will reportedly propose a ceasefire in the air and the sea as a starting point. Rubio has signalled that, yep, that's definitely a possibility. He's also flagged that he's hopeful of resolving the aid issue. So that's where the US paused all military aid to Ukraine. So Rubio is definitely taking a much more statesman-like approach to this, not like what we saw at the White House where Trump and JD Vance, absolutely went in on Zelensky. So hopefully something actually constructive will come out of this.
It's been revealed a caravan found with explosives and a hit list of Jewish locations in Sydney back in January, sparking fears of a major terror event, was all a hoax.
The caravan was never going to cause a mass casualty event, but instead was concocted by criminals who wanted to cause fear for personal benefit.
That was Australian Federal Police Deputy Commissioner Chrissy Barrett speaking there.
Yeah, police have revealed this fake plot was part of an elaborate organised crime scheme to not only distract police from their activities, but also as a tool for incarcerated criminals to reduce their sentences by tipping off law enforcement about these fake plots, which is just insane. Authorities also arrested 14 other people yesterday in sweeping raids across Sydney, and that was in relation to recent attacks on Jewish locations. And according to police, none of the people arrested have displayed any anti-Semitic ideology. So police there are, essentially saying that these were all part of this alleged plot. Now, also they made the point that even though these individuals haven't displayed anti-Semitic ideology, what has been going on has been terrorising the Jewish community because of the fear it instills. Like, even though it's, it might not be coming from a place of racism, that's inevitably how people who are the victim of that would feel. We also did hear from the president of the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies, and he said the incidents in recent months had a chilling effect on the Jewish community. Now, the other question that's come up from this is, Peter Dutton seized upon this at the time and he criticised Anthony Albanese for not revealing it to the Australian public. Now, the interesting thing with this is that police said early on they ruled this plot fake, but they didn't want to make that public because they didn't want to compromise further investigations. So, the question is, how much did which political leader know at what time? We don't have the answers to that. Both the New South Wales Premier and Anthony Albanese had previously labelled the plot a potential terrorist event rather than going all out with that language that it definitely was. So, quite a wild story to come out of all of that.
There's relief this morning for locals in the Queensland town of Ipswich, which had been bracing for major flooding overnight. Levels have peaked below what was initially predicted by the Bureau of Meteorology, and this is, of course, all off the back of ex-tropical cyclone Alfred, which has become one of the East Coast's biggest rain events in decades. To paint a picture there, Sash, Brisbane recorded its wettest day in more than 50 years over Sunday and into Monday, more than 275 mils. Northern New South Wales too has received a drenching, but thankfully conditions have started to gradually ease across Alfred's impact zone as it continues to track inland. But the threat isn't over yet, with the bomb warning conditions are still unpredictable and flooding is still persisting in parts of Queensland, including the Brisbane River and in New South Wales in the Northern Rivers region.
Yeah, look, and finishing today with yet another story coming out of all this weather chaos, and it's to do with our political leaders. So both Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton have been cancelling fundraising events with donors in recent days, and this is after backlash towards the opposition leader who chose to attend a Sydney billionaires fundraiser as Alfred was approaching the East Coast. So it was revealed Dutton chose to fly from his home in southeast Queensland on Tuesday last week to Justin Hems's Harbourside mansion. He's the hospitality giant, owner of Maryvale. And yesterday, Dutton was forced to defend the decision to do that.
I think people who are using that for political advantage in the time of a natural disaster, frankly, that's a poorer reflection on them than it is on me, and I think people recognise that.
So, yeah, that was the opposition leader speaking on Sky News there. Nevertheless, since then, Dutton has pulled out of an evening event scheduled for tonight in Melbourne, and the PM too has cancelled his appearance at what's been called an intimate and exclusive dinner with 10 crucial donors, which was due to happen in Sydney on Wednesday night. So, the fact they're kind of picking up on this mood amongst the Australian public that it doesn't really pass the pub test, it's interesting to see in action.
Yeah, and I think both of them are really eager to avoid a repeat of ScoMo's "I don't hold a hose, mate." Like, that was terrible for him, and that really ruined his chances with the election that he went on to lose. The commentary around this was really interesting because on Sunday I saw Labor frontbencher Murray Watt. He's also a Queenslander. He said Dutton was filling Liberal Party money bags while his own community was filling sandbags. And it looked like that was going to be the campaign line leading up to this election, that's what we were going to hear. Peter Dutton, with the round of media that he did yesterday, he revealed that he was going to his auntie's house to fill sandbags on her property, and then he, ran out of time to tape up his own windows and whatever. Like, he did get out ahead of this because he knew, as do a lot of politicians in Canberra, they know how disastrous it can be if you don't.
Yeah, but we forget, though, that last week Alfred was tracking to hit Thursday. We knew about it well and truly on Tuesday, and Queenslanders were preparing, and Dutton chose to fly to Sydney to go to Justin Hem's Harbourside Mansion for a lovely, intimate dinner fundraising event. So, you're right. He's in damage control a little bit. But, the other thing is that there were other events being cancelled well before the backlash. So, criticism needs to be measured at this. I think there was potentially a misstep, but, leave people to make that decision for themselves. They can decide whether they think it passes the pub test or not. Chris, thank you. Next up, we're getting into a deep dive. Guess what? We're both hosting it.
Ooh.
Bit of fun. And Katrina Blowers is joining us to talk about whether the media completely overcooked Cyclone Alfred coverage. Hello, Sacha, Barbour, Gatt.
And Chris Spyrou with you.
Welcome to the briefing. It is us again. I know you just came from the headlines, but we are here with you for today's deep dive.
Yeah, and Sacha, I want to kick it off with a very important question, a philosophical question, if you will. What would you say the role of us as journalists and the news media as a whole is?
Well, first and foremost, a journalist's job is to inform. That's the main, when you get your job description, you've got to inform people. That's our job, whether it's covering an election or a footy game, even a celeb split. We're at the forefront of gathering news and then disseminating it to our audience.
And what about during a natural disaster? Does our role change in any way?
Well, no, it's the same, but the responsibility actually ratchets up a gear because there's more of a focus on keeping people across information that could be the difference between literal life and death. So an evacuation warning during a fire or a flood, for example. And, a huge part of that comes from, journos on the ground in disaster zones. They'll deliver things like live crosses or reports or updates, whether that's for newspapers, podcasts, radio, or, of course, TV.
Absolutely. And over time, I guess, we've come to see some hallmarks of television coverage in particular. Each and every time there is a natural disaster that strikes, and whether it be a bushfire, flood or tropical cyclone. Perhaps, we've become accustomed to seeing a journo paddling through floodwaters that are barely ankle deep.
Yes.
Or a reporter absolutely copping gale force winds while crossing live to the studio.
Don't make unnecessary journeys. Don't take risks on treacherous roads. And don't swim in the sea.
Yep, that one's quite an extreme example, but we do see it here in Australia too, of those reporters drenched and standing, in front of a raging sea and it's raining all over them and the wind's blowing. It's become a hallmark, you're right.
Yeah, and it's something that we definitely saw on full display over the weekend with reporting of ex-tropical cyclone Alfred, to the point that we saw not one, not two, not three, Sacha Barbour, Gatt, but 12 journalists on a screen at one time, all in different disaster zones.
The battle of the split screens are down to two networks, Channel 7 and Channel 9. Channel 7 got off to a quick start, 2 screens, 4 screens, then 5, then quickly moved up to 6. We thought, where's Channel 9? Then they came in with 10. Then they doubled down on the split screens and did 12. A baker's dozen. Congratulations, Channel 9. You win the split screen awards for Cyclone Alfred.
Yeah, that was someone online talking about just how many reporters they were seeing doing coverage over the weekend. And that has been the chatter online. People confused, I guess, about why so many reporters were needed, especially once the storm had been downgraded. Because obviously there was still a lot of destruction. A man lost his life in floodwaters in northern New South Wales. You know, we also saw 12 members of the Defence Force injured. They got into a collision while responding to the disaster in Lismore. So it was a very serious event. But the mainstream news media is being criticised because people online say they just completely overdid it when it came to Alfred coverage. And the focus wasn't on informing viewers of the most important info, but rather trying to make what some people would call disaster porn.
Yeah, and I mean, also online happening at the same time is people dancing to Michael Jackson's Earth Song and also people surfing mudslides, which, I mean, look, we can make of that whatever we will. But the point is it's really easy to criticise from behind a phone screen and from when you're not really immersed in this industry, in this world. I do personally think the role of mainstream news media is important in times like these for all the points that you made earlier. But I am grappling with the intentions behind wall-to-wall coverage of storms. Like, it's full on.
Yeah. And whether it's necessary, that's a question people are asking, which segues us to our next guest. You all listening should know her. She is a former briefing host, now 7 News Queensland newsreader and chief reporter, Katrina Blowers. Ooh. And I did catch up with her a little earlier to kind of put these questions to her and find out, you were there in the room when these decisions are being made. What's behind them? And I'll play you our chat now, but Chris, stick around with me to the end because I want to see if she changes your mind. Katrina Blowers, thank you so much for joining us back on The Briefing.
It is so good to be back. I've missed you guys.
I have to ask you first and foremost, did mainstream news overdo its coverage of ex-tropical Cyclone Alfred?
So interesting. This has been the number one asked question of us, and we've even asked it of each other. And I think because this weather system has been so unpredictable and irritating from the get-go, it's changed course and changed intensity that many times. So look, in hindsight, now that we're seeing what we're seeing, I don't think we overcooked it at all.
Do you understand the criticism that comes from punters online who just kind of turn on their telly and there's, one, I think it was Channel 9 had 12 reporters out in the field at one point. Do you understand that criticism even as someone working in the mainstream news and at Channel 7 itself? Like, do you get why people think it's overkill?
Yeah, look, I don't think it's the fact that necessarily, the number of reporters that you have out there, because you've got to understand that the breadth of this system and the impact zones stretch for hundreds of kilometres. It's from as far north as Gympie in Queensland down to the northern rivers of New South Wales. So you do need a lot of reporters to cover that kind of stuff. I think where, on reflection, we all need to sit down and have a look at things like, the boxes that you see with all the reporters in the boxes. Has that become a bit of a cliche now? We used to do that because it used to be a real novelty back when the only way you could cross to reporters in the field was to get a satellite link up. So we really wanted to show off that we had that technology. Now that we can cross to people on a phone, I think we all need to sit down and go, if people are giving us a hard time for that and it's become a parody, do we do that anymore? Because you don't want the chatter around the news and about how we're doing it to overwhelm the information, which is really important information in an emergency that we're trying to get across to people.
Yeah, 100%. And I'd love a peek behind the curtain here to explain how the decision is made in a TV newsroom to send people far and wide out to cover a disaster like that. Like, who is making those calls and how are the resources then being divvied up? And are you calling in extra people because you're like, we need people far and wide for this? Tell us how it works.
Yeah, so in a newsroom, we have a news director who is our kind of big boss. We're lucky enough to have a female making those decisions who we all really respect and trust. She's a seasoned journalist herself, so she's been on the ground, and so we all really trust her decision-making processes. And we also have a chief of staff who is kind of like, the air traffic controller of the newsroom. So they're in charge of allocating resources, but the news director decides decides who goes where, and then the Chief of Staff makes the decision of how to resource that. So we have a number of meetings a day, but we have one big one in the morning where we have a link up with all of the reporters, all of the producers. We listen to what the reporters are seeing on the ground. We also have a meteorologist working for us in Channel 7 Brisbane, who used to work for the Weather Bureau and was a senior forecaster for many years. So we are so fortunate that he is able to analyse all of the different forecast maps and tell us exactly what's going to happen, or at least, you know, this ex-tropical cyclone now has been so erratic, but at least kind of make a prediction on where he thinks those winds are going to hit, where it's going to make landfall, where, you know, on the southern side of the system, that's where the bulk of the rain was going to come. So in terms of flood risk, where we should be. And of course, you know, we get alerts from the Premier's office, from the police, the SES. So we know where to station ourselves and where we can really provide value for people watching in terms of getting those emergency alerts out.
I think there's a question though, especially with TV, with the ratings wars, because it is so current and it happens so quickly as to who's performed best on the nightly news or, you know, on the weekend edition, you know, covering the cyclone. How much of the decision making genuinely is based on ratings and kind of drumming up this sense of emergency over actually informing people who are watching?
Yeah, look, fair question. We're a commercial news service, so that's absolutely a fair question. What I'll say is over the last few days, and I've lost track of the number of hours of rolling coverage that we've done. The ratings hasn't even been a topic of conversation. I've been sitting next to my news director. Normally you'd hear whether we won the ratings the night before or not. She hasn't even mentioned it. So day to day, I would say ratings, because we even get minute by minute ratings. So we know whether people have switched off during specific stories and whether, you know, if we've promoted a story, whether that has resonated with our audience or not. So that is a decision-making point that we bring into play every day. But during this, it's honestly about, you know, where is the weather event unfolding and how do we get the most value for our viewers in terms of what they need to know to keep themselves safe.
It's so easy for people to sling mud and take shots online and criticise. But being a journalist and going out, I've been a journalist for a decade, but I've never actually covered a live natural disaster, and I watch the TV journos and radio journos do it as well. They head out to the zone and they are there on the front line, and, you know, it's dangerous and it can be scary. Talk us through what it's like to actually cover an event like this and how scary it is and how tough it is.
Yeah, look, I've been in a couple of cyclones now on the ground, overseas as well, in Vanuatu as well as, you know, far north Queensland. I remember one year Edwina, Bartholomew and I were in Bowen when a cyclone hit, and it was a pretty strong cyclone from memory. I think it was a Cat 3 or 4 when it made landfall. And we were in a pub. This beautiful couple who owned the pub on the main street opened up their pub for us. So where we were, it looked like it was mayhem behind us. You know, there were bits of sheet metal flying down the street, but we were actually quite protected. And I remember Edwina and I made the papers because there were a lot of people criticising us for being out in the elements, but we ended up having to show a bit of behind the scenes that we were quite protected. And I think what we could do better in TV news, and we've had a lot of conversations about this, and I've even included this in the rolling coverage that we've just done, is showing people how we are covering the news and that we aren't actually putting ourselves at risk, because we're telling people don't drive through flooded waters, you know, stay safe, get to higher ground. And I think that can very easily become undone and we become the story if it looks like we're being unsafe. So it's a really fine line to tread of getting to the heart of the action, but also keeping ourselves safe and heeding the messages that we're putting out to the public too.
And just before you go, I did want to do a quick welfare check. You were sleeping on the floor of the 7 offices over the weekend. Have you made it home? Did you manage to get out okay? And also thank you for, you know, the work that you do, obviously trying to keep Queenslanders informed.
Oh, that's so kind. You know, this is the first time that I've been in the studio for a whole natural disaster rather than being out in the field. So, you know, this has been a little bit different for me as well, being part of the rolling coverage, hosting that. And yeah, we're up in Brisbane, we're up on top of a mountain. So there's a lot of huge trees and rock slides that happen during severe weather events, which is what's happened this time as well. We've had to have people out with chainsaws clearing the road so we can get to and from work. But we made the call just with there were wind gusts over 100 kilometres an hour and trees came down, and we, in order to keep broadcasting, had to sleep on the floor. Michael Usher, who'd come up from Sydney to co-host with me, was sleeping on a couch in the boardroom. And it was kind of a fun little, bonding session for us. You know, we've obviously had a heap of conversations. Did we overcook this? Was this a fizzer? But honestly, now that we've seen the extent of the damage, people losing roofs, people getting flooded out, I don't think we did. It's a tough call to make in the moment, particularly when a cyclone behaves so differently like this one did. But I think in hindsight, we kind of played it right.
Katrina Blowers, it has been absolutely lovely to have you back on the briefing. Thank you for sharing an insight and a peek behind the curtain into actually what goes into making these decisions. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
That was former host of The Briefing and now 7 News Queensland's chief reporter and newsreader Katrina Blowers speaking with me there. Chris, what did you think?
Look, I thought it was good. I think Katrina always one eloquent speaker. We love hearing from her. We do deeply miss her from The Briefing. I thought she made perfect sense in terms of the commercial decisions that are made. And historically, I found it interesting unpacking why news teams did those live crosses. Like, I didn't know that was a bit of a commercial flex to do that, to show how cool and high tech you are.
I think admitting, though, that maybe it's time for a rethink in how that looks because it's not the impressive flex that it once was.
Yeah.
And all people see is all these reporters standing in the rain and going, do we really need to do this anymore? So, yeah, I think Katrina, like you said, made perfect sense. And at the end of the day, it's a commercial television network that has decisions to make. But their main priority is to inform their viewers, and that's what they feel like they did.
And she painted a really good picture as to the amount of information that's coming in and how, as journalists, we kind of sort through all of that and give you the most important things. I mean, obviously, when you're doing wall-to-wall coverage, it's not all killer. There is some filler, and we did see that over the weekend. But, I mean, you can't argue with her logic. And so, Katrina Blowers, you have me sold. I'm on board with 12 journos on the screen at one time. I'm on board.
Oh, thank you, Chris. And thank you again to Katrina Blowers for joining us on today's episode of The Briefing. And that is all for now. Before you go, why don't you send this episode to someone who maybe had something bad to say about the mainstream news media over the weekend, thinking that they overcooked it? I mean, maybe you can change their mind with this episode. And one more request before you go, why not go check out our socials and share some of our posts? It's a really easy way you can help support us here at The Briefing and everything we do. We are at The Briefing Podcast on Instagram or on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom.
And while you're at it, chuck us a review. I love reading our reviews, especially the 5-star ones. None of the other ones get a look in, so do feel free to leave a 5-star review. Name your favourite hosts, Sacha, Barbour, Gatt and Chris Spyrou, of course. And we will see you in the review section.
And we will see you tomorrow morning. Thanks for joining us.
Listener.